Hi everyone, this is Jamie, and welcome to another episode of the Yogi Within podcast. Okay, on today's episode, I'm going to be discussing. Let's just check this working. Yep, tapas in relation to yoga practice. So I'm not talking about Spanish cuisine, but I think this word, I'm not going to say gets misinterpreted, but I think it's good for students to think about the intention they have towards their practices and what this might mean, this word tapas, and I'll give my own interpretation of this definition and maybe some more traditional definitions of this word and how we might think about this with our yoga practice. I'll be honest with you, I'm a little bit tired today. I didn't sleep so great last night. I've had a bit of a stressful week, but I put some time aside to do this today. So let's see how this goes. Now, originally, I think I was going to call this episode Finding Your Edge, just from observing some questions that students ask and what they might be unsure about. But I think tapas is a good place to start. So if you're not aware of this word, it has different meanings from different traditions. Generally, within Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, there's lots of different traditions that use this word, but you could say that it's some sort of austerity or asceticism, especially in Hinduism. But really, it's around having an intentional focus towards a practice that is generally aimed at sort of self-realization, you could say. The word tapas, tap in, you could say it means heat. So there's often definitions that will class this as some sort of burning or dissolution of something. So potentially you're generating this heat, this desire, this sort of passion towards self-realization. And there's this heat, this inner heat that's generated to burn through, you could say through delusion, which we could argue is a general pursuit within yogic traditions towards the truth. So we could say that potentially tapas is a desire to burn through delusions. And I would say that is actually a very good way to think about that. Not necessarily asceticism or austerity. This is definitely used within yogic traditions, especially for practitioners who go down that road. I'll give my thoughts and a little bit on that later, but some sort of discipline, you could say, and being a disciple for a practice to burn away delusion. But I think in the Ashtanga world, this is generally thought of as having an intense practice, and I think that this is nuanced, so I'm going to give different views on this. I don't think that's wrong. I think all of us enjoy having a strong physical practice and using pranayama to generate that internal heat that happens in the body and the feeling that we get from having potentially quite an intense physical practice. But I would say that I wouldn't really think of this in terms of the scope of tapas in my view in yogic traditions. It's too asana focused in that way. I think it's better for students to think about this more in terms of the deeper aspects of yoga. Asana is obviously a part of our yoga practice, and having some sort of devotional ritualized practice and intentional practice towards and something that we're focusing on in our practices is obviously part of yoga. But I think that what I often hear in Ashtanga is tapas is this intense heat, you might say, and I think that often that gets associated to having an intense yoga practice. So I'm just going to give my thoughts around this, because the reason I'm bringing this up is because often I'll hear students that struggle with they struggle with acceptance in the terms of how often they practice. And I think that many students carry a lot of guilt and shame around what they do from day to day within their yoga practices. And I think that this is a sad thing, but it's also quite common that potentially as a student you might be an all or nothing student. And what I mean by that is that maybe you don't practice very often, which is fine, but the reason that you don't practice is because you only really want to practice when you can have a super flexible, strong day in your yoga practice. And I would say that if that's the case, then I think it would be good to assess why you might be doing yoga and what brought you to yoga and what your intentions are around your practice. Ashtanga yoga is obviously a very rigorous physical practice potentially, but I think that if your goal and desire is just to have a strong workout and break a sweat and stretch, then as I've said on previous episodes, I would say that you're missing a huge part of what your practice could be about and what the intentions of those practices can be about. I think that lots of really positive things happen from having an intense physical practice. I think there's an embodiment that goes into that, and there's depths that are reached within the consciousness and subconsciousness of our bodies and mind that happens from an intense practice. Obviously, lots of endorphins are released and we feel good. This is something I enjoy immensely, especially, I'm someone who's very physical and I enjoy that a lot. So I love that about yoga practices, but that is definitely not the main reason I practice. It's not the main reason I practice daily. It's definitely not that. If that happens, that's kind of a byproduct, and that's nice to enjoy that, but it's definitely not the reason I start practicing, and it's not the intention I have around it. So when I think of tapas, I think about it more from a Buddhist perspective. I think that what I learned from studying Buddhism was actually mostly around from Buddha's story, that he did many years of austerity. So he did many years of very intense, hardcore asceticism, where really I believe he took his body to a breaking point, potentially near death, from just wasting away and not eating and sleeping and really pushing his body to extremes. And I think that this in Indian practices, this definitely has a history of this, of taking the body and the mind to extremes. And obviously in the West, we would look down upon that potentially. We would frown upon that and think that these were, extreme and not healthy. I'm going to give a nuanced perspective on that later, but for Buddha's journey was really that, that he learned the middle path, which is really what he largely taught, was that going to extremes wasn't very beneficial. And Buddha's story largely discusses that he learned that being nourished by someone and given food, he felt a lot of love and joy and compassion from that, and realized that I think really he wasn't being very kind and compassionate to himself by pushing his body and his mind and his consciousness to such extremes. Now, you could also argue that maybe he would have never have really found the depths of his yogic journey. That wouldn't have happened if he hadn't have gone to those places. And I think there's a good argument to say that. I've often heard from some senior teachers in yoga who really wished they hadn't pushed their body so hard when they were younger. They hadn't gone so hard and practiced maybe with less intensity and were kinder and softer to themselves. But again, maybe they wouldn't be where they were now. They wouldn't have learnt the lessons that they'd learnt. And, maybe they had to go there. Maybe that was part of their journey, actually. Maybe part of their journey was going to those places and taking their body and mind to those extremes for them to learn that lesson. So I think that this is nuanced, yeah? I think that Buddha's story was finding the middle path, and his teaching was about that, was finding compassion and love and kindness, and that there wasn't a need to go to such extremes to find love and joy and bliss in this world. And I think there's a good argument to say that, like, we don't need to do so much. But again, maybe he wouldn't be who he was, and I'm sure he wouldn't be if he hadn't have done that. So I think his journey was all encompassing in that way. He had to go there and find that out. And then from that place, he can teach more love and compassion and kindness, because obviously he's experienced that depth of, I'm not going to say punishment, although I've heard that used in some Indian traditions, such as Jainism, almost like a penance. And I think that has some negative connotations. But I think really what we can learn from that is that maybe some of us do have to go to those places a little bit to experience that, so that we know. I'm a believer in experiential practices. I think that it's great to learn from people where we listen to things, and if we trust that person, maybe we practice in that way. But I think for a lot of us, especially for me in general, I like to experience things myself. I think it's nice to listen to people and learn different techniques and that, but I'm definitely an experience-based practitioner, where I like to feel and experience that myself. So I know moving forward, I know that from a felt place. It's not something that I've listened to and just repeated parrot-like. I like to experience things and embody it myself, so that I know that to be true. And I think that lots of us are like that. So I think that there are potentially some benefits to finding your edge. That heat and that pressure that's generated from quite intense practices definitely does something to the body and the mind that doesn't happen from being soft and from being in the middle. I think sometimes some of us have to go to some extremes to experience what that feels like, to experience that level of discomfort, to experience that level of intensity with breath, or some austerity, some sort of austeric practices that take the body and mind into different places. And I think that this has been used in, many traditions across the globe for thousands of years as a way to take the mind into different places. This is obviously used in lots of tribal traditions, also with different types of psychedelics. This is also another way that practitioners have taken their mind into different spaces using psychedelics. And I think that the goal is kind of the same in a way. You're trying to find ways and techniques to push your limits, to see what you're capable of, or to see what's there, to understand what you feel like when you're in those intense places, to see what it's like to feel alive in some way. And I think that, intense practices definitely make us feel alive. Having an intense experience is potentially a drug. Yeah. And I would also say that intense asana practice could be a bit of a drug. There's lots of endorphins are released. We can get addicted to exercise. I think I might give some different sides to that today, but we feel good from moving and breathing and jumping and flying around and stuff like that on our mats and other movement practices. And I've had friends that do Ironman competitions. My own background in competitive fighting sports, I like that. I liked going to my edge. I liked pushing myself to see, really, I liked experiencing fear in some way. Not that I like the feeling of fear, but I like breaking the feeling of fear. Yeah, I like taking my mind and body into something that makes me feel scared, and then moving through that, like removing fear. I found that to be very rewarding and life-changing, to dissolve sensations of fear. And I've always liked doing that. And I think that yoga's done that in its own way through my subconscious and going to different places of my psyche and my emotional state. I think yoga works with fear in a different way to other types of things that I've done with fear. But I think, again, it's been a bit the same goal. You want to push your boundaries a little bit. You're curious. I've always been a curious person. I think people that go into spiritual practices in a deeper way are generally curious. They're inquisitive in that way. They're seeking, they're searching. They want to find what's behind the curtain. They want to see what's behind, in the back of their mind. They're not afraid to go there. They're not afraid of themselves and to see what's there. And I think that real seekers are like that. They're digging. They like to experience the deeper sides of all things. I've been like that with pretty much everything that I've done, and I like to take myself to the edge a little bit, but not in I wouldn't say a destructive way. I think there's obviously extremes of that, we could say, with substance abuse and things like that. I think those are done for different reasons. That's more potentially escapism or self-destructiveness. I'm talking about more from just experiencing life in an intense way. I've enjoyed that at different things in my life. I've again with fighting sports, but I had an attraction to fast motorcycles for many years. I still do, really. But there's something about balance and speed and fear, and playing with your life in a controlled way, in a way that is exciting and it's attractive. There's a kind of focus that happens from doing that is exhilarating in some way. And I think that it's interesting to see how the mind focuses in those experiences. I remember reading about, I'm not going to go on a motorbike tangent. I definitely could. It's been a passion of mine since I was a kid. But Isle of Man TT, it's a race that happens on the Isle of Man once a year, and it's very dangerous. This is not something I would potentially do, but it's a road race, so it's a race of motorbikes on a public road that's closed for this few days of year, and lots of people die doing this. It's a very dangerous sport, but I'm not bringing it up for that. I'm bringing it up for the reason that they've interviewed lots of the riders, and it's interesting to see what their experience is like doing this race, because they know the road like the back of their hand, but their mind goes into a certain zone when they're in the race, and it's interesting the things that they pick up on. They seem to remember certain smells. I remember reading about one guy that he knew what spectators' type of cigarette they were smoking. It's interesting where the mind goes, potentially doing 200 miles an hour down a country road on an island off the coast of England and Ireland. So it's interesting what happens to the brain and the mind in these very focused spaces. And I think that there are people that enjoy taking their body and mind into these extreme places where your instincts and your intuition are just totally dialed in. You're not really thinking, you're in some kind of flow state, and everything gets heightened. And that's the reason I'm bringing this story up, is that your senses get heightened. And I think this happens in your yoga practice. This happens in an intense Ashtanga yoga practices where you are performing a certain asana, and I'll give maybe Kapotasana is a good example. For most students experience the same, where you have an intense focus. You can't really think about anything else. You have to be 100% dialed into what you're doing, and your concentration goes inward in a very acute, strong way. And I think there's something fascinating about that. There's something that draws us back. I mean, really, Kapotasana, I'm going to stay with this, is a very uncomfortable, deep back bend for most people, and there's a good argument as to why would you do this anyway. But there's something about it, yeah. There's something that draws you in. There's something that is profound in that moment. Yeah, there's an intensity in that moment. You could say that there's a form of tapas in that moment, this inner heat, this flow state, focused attention towards something that is addictive and attractive. And I think that we've all experienced that working strongly in asana, and we could potentially be addicted to that. And the negatives of that could be that, well, that's only what I really get from this. So, if I'm feeling stiff today or tired, then why bother? Why bother practicing? Because I'm not going to be able to have an intense workout. And I think that, again, I've talked about that many times on this podcast. That's a waste of a potential practice. If that's the reason you don't go on your mat, I would definitely have a think about why you're practicing. Is it just an intense workout? Is it just exhilaration you're looking for? Is it intensity you're looking for? Or are you looking to learn something from the deeper aspects of yoga that happens on days where you are stiff? Lots of things are learned, lots of observations are made. And, I would say the deeper aspects of yoga and tapas happen on the days where you are committing to the relationship you've got with your yoga practice, which is what I think happens on that daily check-in. The days when that heat isn't there, that intensity is not there, but tapas, your devotion, your intention towards self-realization, you could say, or just going deeper into your yoga practices, a lot happens on the days that aren't intense and aren't as physical. And I think that again, we have to think about our intention towards these things rather than just looking for some kind of exhilaration. But I see both sides to this. I think it's good to enjoy both sides to these things. I don't think you need to be an adrenaline junkie to enjoy life, but there are some of us that do like that. A friend of mine used to do base jumping for many years. Actually, he used to come to Norway to do this and jump off of cliffs in the fjord, and people would say he was crazy, but he loved it. He always used to ride fast motorbikes as well. Obviously, he's a certain type of character that enjoyed these things, but he enjoyed that intensity and that fear, the risk that happens from these things. And I'm not against that whatsoever. I think that sometimes being on your edge and fear and risk is exciting. I think that you don't have to do these things to have a good life, but there's some of us that do like going to those places. They like going to those edges where you feel more alive. And I think that if you look at most other species, they experience this on a daily basis. Most other species really is life and death most days, I mean, maybe going to get something to eat is risky, going to get something to eat in the forest or in the ocean or wherever this particular animal might be is risky. It's a life and death thing. So, we don't experience that really as humans, but I think there's a part of us that maybe misses that a little bit. I definitely believe that. I think that there is a part of that fear, that real fear of life and death, that fear of a potentiality that might end our life is exciting. As much as it is terrifying, it's also exciting. I think that's why some of us are also drawn to some of these more intense practices and things that do take ourselves to this focused feeling of being alive. And I think that some things do that. Some things do that for us quite quite strongly. And maybe sometimes intense asana can take us to a similar experience in some way, where we're going to the edge of something. We're pushing the boundaries of something. We might be pushing the boundaries of our body a little bit in some ways. We might be going to that edge. I think for a lot of us, there is a desire to go deeper. There's a desire to push. There's a desire to see what's on the other side. I think that this is a natural experience of being alive. I feel a bit like it's related to bandha. in that way with expansion and contraction. I think that it's another form of expansion. When I think about the universe, I think about energy, I think about things moving and contracting, I think about what we're doing with our breath, what we do with certain practices. There's this desire to continue, there's a desire to move forward, there's an innate feeling within us to sort of push boundaries, to go beyond what might be there. And there's a curiosity there. I feel like this is something that is embodied within everything. Yeah, nothing stays stationary. It's always in a state of flux. And I think that when we get too sedentary and things feel a bit too stagnant and too safe, there's something that doesn't feel so good about that. Yeah, too much safety, too much familiarity, too much certainty dulls the senses. Yeah, I believe that. Too much of that dulls the senses. I think that as humans, as beings on this planet, we like to push, we like to be curious, we like to go to the edge of things and explore. And this is, driven society in many interesting and fascinating ways. Nothing is stagnant. Everything is in a state of flux. Everything is expanding and contracting. As we seem to understand this in physics, the universe is expanding at a very fast rate, potentially. Some things are contracting. Gravity, some planets, some stars are in a state of the opposite. There is a contraction going on. So there's these opposite forces that we experience on a minute by minute, second by second basis. And I think our yoga practice, I've spoken about my philosophy on Bandha, is a observation of this. But I think going to edges, exploring those edges, is an innate thing in us as beings on this planet, and I think that some of us like to go there. Now, why is that? Yeah, I might stay with that a little bit, because I think, to me, this is fascinating, because you can find joy and bliss just from sitting and being still. Yeah, you can focus on the feeling of love. You can focus on someone, on something, and within a few minutes, maybe, you can feel a very strong sensation of love, bliss, connection, where you don't need anything. Yeah, it's just magic. It's by focusing your mind on certain things, you can experience very intense feelings of love, bliss, and joy without moving or going anywhere or even interacting with anyone in a physical way. This is a very profound thing that happens from yogic practices, Buddhist practices, tantric practices, where we can experience intense feelings of love, bliss, and joy. This, you could say, this is not really going to any edge, but I would say that some Buddhist practitioners definitely go to the edge of their psyche. Psychonauts. I think of deep meditation practitioners as psychonauts. They are taking their consciousness to extremes, to depths that I don't think most of us really will experience, just because of the way we live. We don't really designate as much time to go into these practices in that way. But talking with practitioners that have gone into these places, this is a very, you could say, psychically extreme in some ways, where they're, again, why do they want to go there? They're interested in the truth. They're interested in burning away disillusions. They're interested in burning away samskaras, these ideas of fantasy or delusion, lies. We're trying to burn through that to see what's underneath the truth. We're interested in what's underneath that, and that's the truth. We're interested in what truth is, which is, again, is one of the major things that we focus on in our yoga practices. But these are also going to some edge in a way. Obviously, this is safer. They're not pushing our body in a physical way, but they're pushing their mind into different spaces, which is also very scary for some people. Sitting and being quiet for 10 minutes is very difficult for a lot of people. Seeing what's there, what thoughts come up, what fears come up, shame, guilt, resentment, anger, bitterness, all of the kind of poisons that we suffer from in the mind. These are right there in front of us when we close our eyes. And this is what I mean by having a daily practice. Yeah, it doesn't have to be an intense, rigorous Ashtanga practice for 2 hours. It could be reflecting on your breath for 20 minutes. It could be having an intention to commit to a practice and to see what happens. Yeah, just to see what happens is to go to your mat and start moving and breathing and see what happens. See what's there. What's the intention? Is it just a physical workout? I think that I'm saying this because it's good to think about why we do these things. Like, what is it? What's the reason you're going to your mat? What's the intention for? And I speak to students who struggle. I actually spoke to a couple of people today, where they have long breaks, and for many reasons, life gets difficult. I'm not being critical. I think it's just good to observe. And, weeks go by, months go by, and their yoga practice suffers. And then, when they're physically feeling good again, or, some things change, and then it's okay to do yoga again. But a lot of the times it seems to be associated with what you're able to do physically. And I think that, again, this to me is not a misuse or a misunderstanding, but it's a waste potentially. I've definitely learned, I would say, a lot of the deeper aspects of yoga when I haven't felt good. Yeah, when I've been struggling, or I didn't want to practice, I didn't want to sit, I didn't want to go to my mat. There was tension there. Yeah, there's something that didn't want me to go there. There was a feeling of not wanting to be truthful in some way. Maybe that's not the right word, but maybe I didn't. Let's phrase this correctly. There was resistance. This is the word. There was some resistance there, and there was a resistance to go there. I think we can learn a lot from ourselves when there's resistance. It's easy to do things when it's easy, yeah? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's nice to experience things when it's easy. It's nice to appreciate something when it's easy, when it just comes to us, yeah? And that's great. We can learn a lot from that. But we can also learn a lot from things when there's resistance. We can learn a lot about ourselves when there's something pushing against us. There's a resistance to something. And my experience of watching practitioners, obviously myself, but my students, is there is a lot. Most of the learning, I would say, in yoga happens from resistance. There's something about heat, pressure, not necessarily intensity, but more resistance. It's more to do with resistance. That resistance can come from an intense physical practice, but it can also come from feeling heavy. It can also come from not wanting to do something. It can also come from feeling stiff and tired. There's something resisting you doing something, yeah? And I think that what I've learned is you can learn a lot from just observing yourself when you're in a state of resisting something. Yeah? I'm saying this to encourage people to practice when you feel resistance, to encourage you just to see what's there. You don't have to do so much. You don't have to go to your edge, but maybe going to your edge is just seeing yourself in a state where you have a lot of resistance to something. That might not have anything to do with asana. For stressed people, if you are someone who's super stressed, who had quite a high-powered job, they would probably be quite happy to do something very physically intense. Yeah, it's an extension of the space that they're already in. But if you ask that person to sit and be soft and be quiet for 20 minutes, this could feel impossible. There could potentially be a lot of resistance to that, yeah? I think it's interesting to explore our edges in different ways, yeah? For some of us, maybe we don't meet our edge so much, by having super strong asana practices twice a week, and then 5 days a week we don't do anything else, because our yoga practice is that. It's 2 really intense, physically demanding practices, and in 5 days a week you don't really do anything. Maybe there's not much resistance there. I'm not saying that you need to make things hard. I think just, again, intentionally, what are you doing with practices? It's got a lot to do with being uncomfortable. There's so much to be learned, I believe, from being uncomfortable. Yeah, there's something that happens in that process. There's something that the mind, the ego, gets involved with when there is a lot of resistance to something. And again, that doesn't have to be physical. Yeah, it's something about being uncomfortable. You're met with reality in a different way. I think there's something about that when something's easy and it's going our way and it's what we want, and there's no resistance to something, that's also a very good state. You could say that might be a bit of a flow state, but there's something that happens with effort, heat, and resistance. And I think that for practitioners that are curious, it's interesting to explore that. I think there's depths that are reached in our yoga practices from that doesn't happen in other spaces. I think that as humans, we're drawn to that. I think a lot of us are drawn to that. A lot of us realize that when our lives are too sedentary, too sedate, too safe, where there's no risk, it just feels like you're not really alive in some way. And I think that while we're here, we like to feel alive. You know, that's a feeling we want, to have our senses alert. Yeah, we're kind of tuned in, and our senses are very aware of what's going on around us. We're not dulled and dumbed down. This is one of the reasons I don't drink alcohol. You know, alcohol dulls the senses. Yeah, this is a depressive, I would say, in terms of different types of drugs. It just numbs everything down, dulls everything down. That's not something I enjoy in life. I enjoy feeling sharp and my senses just acute. You know, I like that feeling. I like feeling very aware of everything that's around me. It's something I enjoy. It's something that makes me feel more alive. Again, you don't need to do extreme things to feel alive, but I think that it's a sensory thing. You're more in tune with your senses. And when you sharpen those senses, which is what I think an authentic yoga practice does, you like that feeling. You like feeling very aware and very akin to what's around you. I would say that I've had extreme experiences of that in different states with, again, fast motorbikes and other fighting sports and stuff I've done before in the past. But also in nature, I think this is something we definitely experience in nature. I had an experience, I don't know how much I want to say about this, and I could probably tell this as a short story, but I've been to India many times, and one trip I went into Nepal. This was the first time I went to Nepal, and I hiked in the Himalayas for 3 to 4 weeks, and it was one of the best trips I've ever had, actually. Just, you know, continuous hike, and summited a peak around, I think it was around 6,000 meters, and descended with some friends. And I had some very strange experiences in Nepal, actually. I haven't really talked too much about this on this podcast, but I had a life-changing experience, really, in Nepal. I've had a few life-changing experiences in travel in India also, but this one in Nepal was different. I was there for a few months, and I cannot explain this. There's many times I've experienced flow states in my life, but for some reason, when I went to Nepal, I experienced it for months. I honestly felt like I was in like a flow state for 2 or 3 months, like on a daily basis. I've never felt so, like, you know, when you're in the right place at the right time with the right people. I experienced that in a very intense way on this trip. It was like I was meant to be there, and I think my friends felt that too. But anyway, the long story short was that on the day we were supposed to summit this peak, this is not technical climbing, it's more just elevated hiking really. There was a point where 3 of us were on our own, and one girl got altitude sickness really badly. And again, this could be a really long story, so I'll try and keep it a little bit shorter. But out of the 3 of us, I was the one that felt responsible for this situation. Let's just put it that way. And I was feeling great that day. I actually felt a little bit of altitude sickness a few days before, but I managed to kind of resolve that. And this is very common in this area, you know. It's often, maybe daily actually, you'll see helicopters flying people off the mountain who have got altitude sickness because they ascended too quickly and things like this. It's very common. So I went into this kind of troubleshooting headspace of, okay, how are we going to deal with this? Because there's a point on the ascent where you have to kind of commit to going over or you go back. And there's a kind of point of no return just from a daylight perspective and temperature and food and everything, where you either try to go over and descend the other side or you go back. And I was carrying my friend's pack as well because she couldn't carry her pack. So I had 2 packs on me, and I kind of knew that it was me that was going to have to make this decision, and I decided that we should go over. But I felt very responsible for someone's life actually in that situation. Reflecting on it later, it doesn't feel as serious, but at that time, in that moment, it felt like a very serious decision and something I felt very responsible before, because it was me that was making the decision to go over. And it wasn't so long, a few years ago, before that trip, that a large amount of people died on this peak actually, just because there was a weird snowstorm. And I think that was in my mind also. There was lots of things going on in my mind, but long story short, it was the right decision. And we went over and descended the other side, and it worked out pretty good. And once we started to descend, she started to feel better. You know, every 50, 100 meters we went down, she started to feel a bit better. But and you know, I felt great that day, so it was fine for me to carry her pack and do all that work, and it was cool. It worked out really great, and that was a great trip. But the reason I'm bringing it up, because after that experience, and after I descended down the other side and we got back to our original spot where we had our base, I felt the most intense feeling of just being alive. I actually can't really describe that in words. I've never felt so alive in my life. And I think just being in the Himalayas and having that experience and being in the mountains for so long, it just intensified it. And I think it was also to do with what felt like not a near-death experience, but something that you were deciding things in that way, and you weren't, you were in a very vulnerable spot somewhere. And I just remember feeling this intense feeling of being alive, and it lasted for about 2 or 3 weeks. It was like being high in some way. And I remember thinking at the time, because there was lots of peaks around that area where people die often trying to climb these peaks. And you get a bit of a sense of why some people do that. And, some people are drawn to those experiences. I think they're drawn to taking their mind and their body into that space where it's very risky. And I think as humans, some of us are drawn to that in some way. Some of us are drawn to some of those more intense experiences that, like I say, most species experience on a daily basis. There's something about risk. Yeah, life is risky. Yeah, I think it's all right to have risk in life. I like a bit of risk. It kind of makes you feel alive. I think in certain controlled environments, obviously, we don't want to go around taking ourselves to too many extremes. But I think that there is something innate in a lot of us that likes that feeling of not feeling so safe, where life feels a little bit bland potentially, and we like to kind of push ourselves and go to some edges. You can experience that a little bit. I do with downhill skiing in a very controlled way. It's something about speed and balance And, a little bit of risk is cool. It feels good. It feels very natural, actually, the way the body adapts to movement and risk and being in those environments and being self-reliant. I remember talking to Ian Greisack, actually, who's been on the podcast. I know he likes to do that in nature a little bit, where you just out on your own and being self-reliant. There's something about that feels very natural as a human being, and there's an element of risk there. You're in a natural environment. It feels very normal in a way, even though it's a little bit sketchy. So I think that the reason I'm saying this, I think this is an innate thing in humans, is to push boundaries, choose things that are slightly intense and some risk, and see what's there. Like I say, we want to be a bit uncomfortable. We want to not feel anxious, but there is an anxiety that in some way that necessarily isn't bad. I think the word anxiety actually has too much of a negative connotation in the English language and in general in culture, where we feel that being anxious about something is bad. I remember this as a quote from Heidegger: is anxiety is born out of freedom. And I think that there's truth to that. Yeah, again, to be anxious in some way is to be free. Yeah, I think about this. If anyone listening to this runs your own business, there's a lot of freedom in that, but there's also an anxiety that comes with that. And I think that you could apply that to most things that make you feel anxious. It's the unknown, yeah? It's the uncertainty, not knowing, it's not predictable. And I think some of us like that. Some of us have learnt to be all right with some anxiety, yeah? But you also get a lot of freedom with that. And again, I think this is a fair price to pay. I don't even think about it as a price to pay, actually. I think it's cool to feel some anxiety around unknown and getting used to not knowing the answer to things, not knowing what might happen. I think yoga's taught me that, actually, also, is to be comfortable in things that make you feel uncomfortable. Yeah, this is a life lesson, I think, and this is what I mean when I go back to why you practice. Yeah, I'm not going to say that I like being in pain or something, but I've learnt to be all right when things are uncomfortable. I've learnt to sort of not run away from anxiety, not flee and run when I feel something that makes me feel a lot of discomfort. I think that when you're able to kind of be in those spaces and realize you're going to be all right, there's a lot of strength that can be gained with that. And I think this is definitely some of the intentional things I have personally around my yoga practice, around comfort. Yeah, I think really this will go back to tapas again, yeah, in terms of inner heat or devotion or dedication to something, where that's an important thing to do. It's an important thing to use that as a way to channel that energy, so that your meditation practices, your asana practices, or whatever practices this tapas is associated to, it doesn't deter you. You're determined, you could say. Tapas could be another definition, could be determined. I used the story of Milarepa and Marpa before on this podcast, which is great for that, because Milarepa is really famous in Tibet as being determined. Yeah, he would not be deterred. His devotion to the practice was unbreakable. And I think you could say that that's another example of tapas. You could say that his story could be classed as extreme in some ways in the pursuit of truth. Yeah, I don't think all of us have the same need or dedication as Milarepa, but we can embody that in our own way in our practices, where it's good to find your edge. It's good to go beyond that edge sometimes, but I think we can also learn from Buddha's story of the middle path. Yeah, I think we all have to find that balance, and I think that's different for everyone. Some of us are more drawn to going to the edge and finding our edge. Some of us are not. Some of us have a different type of energy. You could say a certain type of dosha, potentially from Ayurveda, where we need a little bit of a kick. We need a little bit of a push. We're a little bit more on the dull side. We're a little bit more on the heavier side, and we don't have that same gusto to push forward. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think what we learn from Ayurveda is to balance those doshas out. You know, for some of us that are more fiery and we go to the edge a lot, we can also embody the opposite of that. Something that's kind of softer, that doesn't push so hard. And again, using Buddha's story, you know, coming back to the middle path. Really, I think this comes back to balance and bandha. You know, it's not good if we're just going to the edge all the time. It would be exhausting and potentially harmful. But also, you know, being dull in our senses, sedentary, and not really having any effort and being lazy also isn't good. It's always generally somewhere in the middle. Or maybe we ebb and flow between those opposites, but you know, ultimately, again, we're trying to find that state of bandha. So you could say those are two states, yeah? Finding your edge and, you know, kind of laziness, dullness. You know, we might flick between those at different periods, but we're trying to find that steady medium. I actually said that to a student this morning around practice, you know, that generally steady is good, yeah? It's good to go to some edges sometimes, but more often than not, steady is good. Being steady and consistent tends to have a better effect in the long run, rather than, you know, yo-yoing. And that's what we could be doing in terms of bandha. We could be yo-yoing between two opposites, two states. Maybe I've said enough on this. Just checking my notes. I remember, actually I wrote this down, I remember listening to an interview with David Bowie, and he said if you're out of your comfort zone a little, on your edge, where it feels a bit scary, this is kind of where you want to be. And I think he was talking about this from a creative perspective, and I think what he means is that we like for our senses to be active. And I think that there's something about creativity, there's something about flow states, there's something about love also that happens in these states where you're a little bit on your edge, you're a little bit out of your comfort zone, and you're going beyond what you're used to, and you push that boundary a little bit. There's something that happens in that space energetically that doesn't happen from a laziness space. Again, I'm thinking about this in terms of bandha and energy. To me, if you thought of the word lazy, it's flat. Yeah, lazy to me is no movement. It's flat, sedentary, stuck. These are the words that come up when I think of that. It's like energy that's not moving. It's just stagnant. Yeah, not much happens there. When things are moving, yeah, when we're moving energy around, when we're breathing, we're moving, we start to cultivate some creativity, something starts to happen. And I think for most yoga practitioners listening to this, you'll know this from your practice. I heard this many times from students where in Shavasana or after their yoga practice, they get a lot of ideas, a lot of creative ideas, their imagination kicks in. There's something that happens from cultivating that kind of energy in your movement practices and your yoga practices. Yeah, that happens even in the most basic ones. This is why another reason why I practice daily is that it's like what's the word? You just tap into this other space. There's this other zone that you tap into that, like whenever I get ideas that come from that space, or thoughts or notes, I always write them down. Yeah, often after my yoga practice, I'll get ideas about things, creative ideas, intuitive things that I think I might do, and I generally write those down, and I generally always action those. It's because I think that when things come from that space, I trust them completely. It's like I have no doubt over what comes up from that space. It's not influenced by someone else. It's not another story from someone else. It's coming from deep within me. It's this intuitive space that is like an idea vacuum, you know, it comes from somewhere deeper within, and I trust that implicitly. It's like whatever comes from that is probably good, and what comes up from that, I should probably action that. I know that that's coming from a good place, and it might be also something I don't like. It might be a truth I need to hear. It might be something I've avoided. You know, again, this is what happens from the daily practice, yeah? Is that what comes up from that intuitive space within you from your practice, whether it's an intense on your edge asana 2-hour Ashtanga practice, or it's 20-minute meditative check-in, thoughtful mindfulness practice, where you're basically practicing pranayama, what comes up from that space is gold, yeah? This is like mining for gold. So I think that if some of you are lacking motivation for practice, there's lots of reasons to get on your mat. There's lots of reasons to check in and be mindful, meditate, pranayama, asana. There's lots of reasons to do these practices that cultivate intuition. If you want to think of one of the biggest benefits you get from this is cultivating your intuition. Your intuition is gold. It is your absolute compass. It is totally trustworthy, and you should listen to everything your intuition tells you. More than anything or anyone, more than me, is trust your intuition. And I think we're happiest when we're trusting our intuition and knowing whatever comes from that is the truth. Yeah, but it might be things you don't like. It might be stories you don't want to see. But what comes up from there is the truth. This is tapas. Yeah, I might finish with this. This is the goal of tapas, yeah? This is what you might define as tapas, is that seeking intuition, using asana, using pranayama, heat, tap, generating that heat to connect with your intuition, which you could call God, yeah? This could be God. This could be the source. This could be your connection to everything. Because what comes up from that space, in my experience, is undefinable in some ways. It's just, you know it. You know it to be true and you trust it. It's something that speaks within you. There's a quote on my website from Rumi. There's a voice that doesn't use words, yeah? And I put that quote on my website for that reason, because one of the things I'm so grateful for my yoga practice is cultivating your intuition. I'm going to leave it there. Ciao.